And we welcome you to In the Circle Live here. Eric Lopez alongside Victor Anderson and our guest, Justin McLeod. You know him as Justin's World, but he's got a new title we're going to explain in a moment. But welcome. This is our year-end review special live here. Make sure we will take your questions and comments. And Victor, tell the audience where they can find us.
Of course, follow us as always on In the Circle SB on Twitter and Facebook. You guys see our Twitter handles down below. We got a lot of things we're going to talk about on tonight's live show. We're going to talk about realignment. We're going to talk about the games of the year, athlete of the year, coach of the year, moment of the year, and we're going to announce who our first guest will be for the 2022 season. So be ready for all of that. But Mr. Lopez, you kind of mentioned to it, our friend over there, Mr. McLeod, he's made himself some news as well.
Well, that is my the top story of 2021 to some. Justin McLeod now of Extra Innings. Now, Justin, tell us the audience about the move, because I know when this was announced a couple months ago, it created a buzz a little bit. We've gotten questions about it. People wondering about what does it mean for the show. Obviously, you're still welcome on the show. People are like actually wondered if you would welcome you on the show. I'm like, yeah, we're
of course.
But just tell us about the move and what led you to the move and what people can now expect with you now at Extra Innings.
Well, until you guys told me I was the topic leading off here, I'm honored. This is nice. Honestly, it was unexpected. But I've known Brent Eads, who runs Extra Inning, for a while, and when he approached me about it, we talked a few more times, and at the end of the day, it was just a great opportunity. It gives me a chance to, concentrate on college softball primarily, which has always been my first love, if you will. Still do some pro stuff and all that, but really be able to channel and focus and all that. And plus, let's be honest, National College Softball Editor is a way sexier title than, just running your own website. It sounds so much better on a business card.
There you go, Tyler. So we expect the same coverage as usual. There might be some contributions from other people we won't get into, but I expect some bracketology and TV articles in 2022 over there at Extra Inning Softball. But hey, man, congrats on the move. You were on the move. And a lot of programs are going to be on the move down the road. That's what we call a segue, people. One of the bigger stories, not just in college softball in 2021, but perhaps the biggest story in college athletics is conference expansion and realignment. And boys, this was a dominant story, especially from the summer on. And it all started with the blockbuster news around the big SEC football media days that Oklahoma and Texas are gonna leave the Big 12 to go to the SEC. We don't know when that is. Officially, it's 2025, but obviously I think there's some behind-the-scenes working there to try to make
lawyers
that sooner.
are involved.
And that just caused a huge domino effect, Justin. I'll start with you on this. What's your reaction to this realignment here? Because it's been a ton. This caused a huge domino effect that we are still feeling and are going to be wondering here for the next year or two. This is going to be a story that will continue into 2022 and beyond.
Yeah, and realignment's not new. Every year, the last couple of years, you've seen a few teams go here and there. You saw a few. You joined the ASUN this year, but I don't think anybody expected movement to the magnitude of Oklahoma and Texas. Like that. That's two of the blue bloods in college sports and pretty much every sport. Truth be told, I think college softball, behind college football, which is the obvious one, I think college softball might be the sport that feels this realignment the most, because you saw a lot of college softball blue bloods, maybe not end of the day national college sports blue bloods, but for softball, it's some of the better, best, most consistent teams. You saw them in play here throughout this realignment. I mean, you're talking about 10 of 32 conferences. Like, that's 1/3 almost of the Division I conferences that saw additions. That's not counting the ones who saw subtractions. That's just ones that added teams in this round so far. I mean, I don't think anybody anticipated it, but it has changed the landscape of college sports, and I think it's changed the landscape of college softball once all this realignment takes effect. Like you say, SEC, Oklahoma, Texas, 25 officially, probably not going to be to 25, but then you've got others that are going to happen before after at set times, that kind of thing. I think it's changed the entire sports and the entire softball landscape.
Let me read off some of the moves. If we don't get to your move, sorry, school. All right, there's a lot.
Nothing personal,
but there's a lot. Oklahoma and Texas moved to the Big 12. That affects the Big 12 to make a move to try to survive, and they did that by adding UCF, Cincinnati, and Houston. Obviously, Cincinnati doesn't have softball, so in this show it doesn't matter. But no. Houston, UCF, and BYU, UCF and Houston from the American, BYU from the West Coast Conference. That causes the American then to make a move. They made a lot of moves. You're going to add UAB, Charlotte, North Texas, FAU, UTSA from Conference USA, including Rice, but Rice doesn't have softball. Conference USA was like in survival mode. They have added Liberty from the ASUN, a league you know well, Victor.
Yes, I do. Jacksonville
State, Sam Houston State, and New Mexico State. And Victor, I want to go to you on this because we have been talking about the ASUN. They were kind of quietly making moves aggressively prior to all this chaos.
Right.
They had added Jacksonville. Jacksonville State's going to be in the ASUN, basically a possibly one and done, among others. Talk about the vision that the ASUN had, because it's definitely been altered because of all these other moves.
Well, the ASUN had been doing realignment for several years, starting with the addition of Liberty into the league back in 2017, 2018. Then this past July, they officially added 3 new members, Central Arkansas, Eastern Kentucky, and Jacksonville State, into the league fold. And then in early September, they made the announcement that they're going to add Austin Peay to the conference. That won't be until July 2022. So if you think about it, you subtract Jacksonville State and Liberty, and you add Austin Peay, that puts the ASUN at 11 teams. Does the ASUN go after another conference? Maybe do they go again, dipping into the Ohio Valley for a 12 conference? Do they go somewhere else to maybe add a 12 member to the league? And then whatever league does the ASUN plug that team out of, do they try and compensate for that? So this is the third and the biggest and most seismic wave of musical chairs that we're seeing right now. And it's going to have long-lasting implications, not just in Division I. We're seeing conferences like the Southland take teams from Division II and move them up to Division I. Primarily football-based, but as I mentioned, we're a softball podcast.
Texas A&M Commerce being a big one there, Victor, from Division II, going from the Lone Star Conference to the Southland. The Lone Star seems to be the league that's going to get picked on here.
Yes.
And it's such a wild deal. But, I mean, we've got other moves here. Like Belmont is going to the Missouri Valley, leaving the Ohio Valley Conference. You mentioned the Austin Peay. Incarnate Word leaving the Southland, going to the WAC.
Mm-hmm.
You got Southern Utah going to the WAC from the Big Sky, Loyola Chicago going from the Missouri Valley to the A-10. It's just on and on and on. And perhaps the Sun Belt adding Marshall from Conference USA, Southern Miss from Conference USA, and James Madison from the Colonial. And what was significant about this was this caused a really interesting effect. You had the Sun Belt announce, talking about softball being a big reason why they're adding JMU. This caused the Colonial Athletic Conference to all of a sudden be a little petty and say, no, James Madison, you're not going to be allowed to participate in the Colonial Athletic Conference tournaments moving forward. This was a blockbuster. This made national headlines. Dan Wolken of USA Today wrote about it. Everybody's bashing the Colonial, rightfully so. We had, Victor, Lauren Laporte on the show, and she addressed this move, and it was very classy how she addressed it. A lot classier than I would have been, because it's just going to be a big story, Justin. Going into 22 is James Madison won't be eligible for the Colonial Athletic Conference, which will have a rippling effect come Selection Sunday.
Yeah, that's a big part of this realignment is it's all happened this year in a matter of months. It doesn't feel like just a few months, but in a matter of months. And the thing is, some of these moves are a few years off. Some will happen in the nearer future. You mentioned Austin Peay, for instance, going to the ASUN next year. But you're right. Then you get into the extra stuff of Okay, well, what happens to the Colonials' automatic bid next year? That's right away. It's the season that's 2 months away now. Or less than 2 months away. What happens to the Colonials bid? Because so used to it being James Madison. James Madison's hosted the conference tournament. Can't do that now. That changes the look of the tournament. That changes the look of the conference. Everything.
And Justin, to kind of go piggyback your point, we've seen conferences not go to the extreme that the Colonial did with not making James Madison eligible, but we've seen conferences like the American strip hosting sites from schools that are leaving. UCF was supposed to host the American softball tournament this year. They lost that privilege, and now it's going to be hosted by East Carolina in Greenville, North Carolina. And if anybody knows about traveling to Greenville, North Carolina, it's a gentleman over to our far left, and Mr. Lopez.
Yeah, that's me. Don't remind me about that. Now, there's still a lot of great questions out there. One of them are here from our great listeners. We have so many great loyal fans and listeners. Kristen Johnson, who's a loyal listener, asked this question. This is a question, Victor, you and I have addressed on the podcast throughout the year, and we're fascinated by it, which is what schools should the West Coast Conference invite? Obviously, the West Coast Conference, a smaller league, losing BYU, that's a big loss for them.
Because
Victor,
it puts them down to 5 members.
5 members. I want to start with you, Vic. Who do you think the West Coast Conference, what do you think they do? And Justin, then you could follow Vic.
It would not surprise me in the slightest if the West Coast Conference invites some schools from Division II to move up to D1. It would not surprise me in the least because the West Coast Conference is right now what at once upon a time Conference USA was a few months ago. They're in survival mode. They're trying to find a way to keep softball as a eligible sport in that league. So it would not surprise me if you see members, if they send invites to the Pac West, if they send out invites to the CACC, that's the conference, that's the California Athletic Association Conference. That wouldn't surprise me if they did that. Or something else that I was kind of kicking in my brain. Do you see the West Coast Conference maybe dissolve softball altogether and join up with some of those schools and play? Some of them go to the Big Sky, because the Big Sky, they're kind of in a similar situation where their membership is dwindling down as well. So it's a very fascinating situation with the West Coast Conference because there's so many different avenues that they can go to, and that can set a ripple effect in terms of the Big Sky, possibly the WAC, because they're losing a few members as well. And again, Division II is going to be in play here in all of this.
Thoughts, Justin?
So one thing about the West Coast Conference I think is interesting is losing BYU doesn't end the conference, but it's such a huge piece of the conference.
Yes.
If you look at, because there's 10 overall members in the West Coast. Some of them don't play softball, but you got 10 overall members. After BYU, the next biggest school in the West Coast Conference is 1/3 that size of BYU. That's the next biggest. So when you look at BYU, the rest of the West Coast Conference is a very interesting parity field after BYU. Second thing, I think the West Coast Conference is going to base a lot on basketball. It's not a football league. It's going to be a basketball league. And then the Olympic sports like baseball, softball. One thing I find interesting is the possibility that the West Coast Conference could poach a couple of schools from the WAC. I think that's interesting because you've got some schools in the WAC that are private religious-based institutions, which every school in the West Coast Conference is. So if you want to follow a similar mold of what's already there, there's a few sitting there coming out of the WAC. For instance, a Cal Baptist, Abilene Christian fits the bill. Grand Canyon fits the bill. So there's a few that are possibilities, I think. But I think that's something that's interesting, too, because I think that the West Coast Conference is going to be picky because I don't think they're just going to add in a school just for the heck of it. But I do think looking at some D2s is interesting. And then I think there's a couple from the WAC that I don't know that the West Coast Conference could pull them over. It depends on how the WAC reorganizes itself to a certain extent, I think. But I think it's interesting because there's some in the WAC that fit the West Coast Conference model in terms of how the schools are set up, attendance numbers. Nobody's going to replace BYU. You just kind of got to figure out how to fortify the conference at that point.
So here's the question. Now we've talked about all the schools and where they're going. I think this is all going to start around fall of 2023. So I think it's going to take I think a lot of these schools are going to be in lame duck years until then. Who's the biggest winner, either a school or conference, in your opinion, from all this movement, and who's the biggest loser, either school or league, from all this movement? Who wants to take that one?
I'll go first on that one. The biggest winner for me has to be the Sun Belt. You already have a strong league as is with Louisiana, with Texas State, with Troy, South Alabama, and then programs ascending like Louisiana Monroe. But to add James Madison up their run to the Women's College World Series and the sustained success that they've had with Lauren Laporte at the head of the program, Marshall with Megan Smith-Lyon, who is battling to be in Conference USA at the top of that league, and you add Southern Miss as well to go along with that depth that we've already highlighted. And I've said this to Eric once we found out that James Madison and Marshall were going to make that move to the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt can make a case once all of this realignment musical chairs settles in. They can make a case to be a top 5 league in softball with the talent, with the depth, with the power at the top of the league. They may be better once everything gets settled than some of the Power 5 conferences like the newly renovated Big 12 or Big 10 down the line. But I think the Sun Belt is the biggest winner in this latest round of realignment.
What do you got, Justin?
I mean, I agree. I think the Sun Belt's a big winner. I think the American did a nice job, but can we not overlook the fact that the SEC is adding Oklahoma and Texas? I mean,
well that's a given.
But
let me ask you that. Let me chime in on that though. Is that good for the SEC or not? Because now you've got this supersized league. It's going to be interesting how the schedules work. Do we run the risks now that the sport becomes all about the SEC, where before it was a West Coast sport, now it's all in the SEC? Does it cannibalize itself? Is it a good thing moving forward? You're right. The SEC. I mean, Oklahoma. That is. Forget football. That's the biggest acquisition of any sport is softball for the SEC. Because Texas has been mediocre in football. Oklahoma's been pretty good at things. But softball, that's a superpower. But is that necessarily a win? Because I would argue there are certain SEC programs that are going to get hurt by this move that usually would make the tournament that now may not, because that's an extra 3 to 6 games, depending on how they decide to do the schedule, could hurt them. No?
I think it's still good for the league because what I think the SEC's done is your top part, your top half, whatever portion you want to say, has just gotten that much stronger. I think you've just taken. Yes, there is going to be some cannibalization within itself. Yes, the SEC being so strong may not be good for other parts of the game and other leagues, etc. But for the SEC specifically, I think it's a huge home run. You've got Oklahoma, who outside of UCLA and Arizona is the most storied team in softball history. Outside those 2 blue bloods from the West Coast, Oklahoma's next, I would argue. They're riding, the last decade and a half, think about how good Oklahoma's been. Just how long Patty Gass has been there, just narrow it down to a decade and a half, think about how good Oklahoma's been. And you're getting Texas at a point where Texas is improving to somewhere they had not been for several years. Now, granted, they still hadn't gotten over that World Series hump under Mike White, but they've gotten pretty darn close and a lot closer than they had gotten in the several years before he got there. And they look like a contender. It's not, there was that one time Texas got to the World Series and they didn't really look like they belonged there. Well, now Texas isn't getting there and looks like they belong there to a certain extent. So you've added 2 blue bloods in the sport, a perennial champion, a perennial contender. You've added 2 schools that are going to invest in the sport. And sure, some of the ones at the bottom of the conference probably have a right to be upset about it because the bottom of the conference just got lower. And the bar just got a little higher that you have to jump over, even if you're at the bottom of the conference. But at the same time, use LSU 2021 as your model. LSU played a ridiculously tough schedule in a year a lot of people didn't. and they lost a nice amount of games, but they got rewarded for playing the tough schedule. I think that's the model we're going to see happen when Oklahoma and Texas get to the SEC is, you know what? Sure, Oklahoma might have lost 6 games, but if 2 of them are to Florida and 1 of them's to Alabama and 2 are to LSU and 1's to Tennessee, well, then how darn bad is that really? And I think that's what we're going to see. And by that, I think the SEC at some point is going to have, 7, 8 teams in the World Series one year. And
oh boy, that could be a hot seat. Boy. I agree with both of you. By the way, the Sun Belt, from a league standpoint, it's the biggest winner. I'm going to go individual schools just to give a different answer. I think UCF and Houston could be the biggest winners from an individual school. And the reason I say that is Oklahoma and Texas they're fine, eat wherever they are, right? You look at UCF Houston going to the Big 12, more resources. I'm not going to say it's like the Big 12 is an upgrade because you lose Oklahoma, Texas, and softball. That hurts. But I think the Big 12 rebounded well. But I think UCF and Houston, you give them now those resources of a major conference. These are 2 programs that have been knocking on the door, right? Then have been in the regional finals and consistent winners for the most part. You put them in a Big 12 league, a stronger league with more resources, could be 2 programs that could become major players in college softball and be deep threats in postseason here.
If you want to talk about individual teams, I got to throw out there Charlotte, North Texas, UAB, the top contingent that went from Conference USA to the American. 2 reasons. One, you're taking a bump up in league. Yes, you're still group of 5 to group of 5, unless you ask Mike Oresco. But at the same time, you're moving up in stature. But I think also by moving up to the American, I think you're going to see those 3 schools are climbing. All 3 of them are climbing within softball. So I think you're going to see, and they've got coaches that are in good positions, and they've got talent coming, and they're all hitting on positive cylinders. And now you take that step up. I think you're going to see more commitments from the schools to their softball programs because the programs are improving. I think those 3 are to the same kind of points you said. I think the step up is going to be really good for those 3 programs.
That's good.
I think in terms of a team, and as crazy as it might sound, we'll stick with the Big 12. I'm saying Oklahoma State. Because you take out those big roadblocks with Oklahoma and Texas. Because remember, Oklahoma State has had to beat Texas each of the last 2 seasons to get to Oklahoma City. That's gone now, potentially. And you add UCF and Houston. So the Big 12 is more winnable.
That's an interesting philosophy. I didn't think about that. That's a great point. A school that not necessarily – you could benefit from this and not move. Either way,
exactly.
Right? I mean, that's your point about Oklahoma State. From that standpoint, you're not chasing Oklahoma. To your point, real quick, to me, the biggest losers, Conference USA.
Yes,
Shredded. This was a once proud league. Victor, you and I covered this league.
Yes,
when it was in its prime. We've had Tony Paisley on, Allison Kime on, Angel Shamblin. This was a league that would be a 3 or 4 bid
by the way, for those of you who listen to our podcast, the Angel Shamblin from the University of Houston, not to be confused with the Angel Shamblin of the same name who coaches at Chico State.
True. A lot of Hall of Famers we just mentioned there.
Yes, you did.
Like Rachel Fold. I mean, this was a proud league, a 3 to 4 bid league. It's been decimated. And I think the biggest loser from a school standpoint is Liberty, Victor, because they go from a strong league. I think the A-Sun's a strong league, the way that they're set up, to the CUSA. I think it's a drop-off for them. It's going to hurt. I think those are the big losers so far from realignment.
You can make an argument, Eric, that the A-Sun right now is a stronger league than what they'll be joining in Conference USA in the next couple of years. And look, Dr. Dot Richardson, she's going to win wherever she goes. But the quality of competition in the A-Sun with a Florida Gulf Coast, with a Kennesaw State, especially this year with Eastern Kentucky and Jacksonville State, 2 perennial tournament teams and joining in that league, that's gonna hurt. That's gonna hurt Liberty's resume. So it's gonna force the Flames to schedule tougher out of conference to potentially make up what they're not going to be getting in Conference USA in a few years when they move leagues in 2023.
Justin, do you agree that's the biggest loser there, or do you got somebody else in mind?
The CUSA, the Conference USA is a major loser. But actually, I think the Big 12 is the biggest loser here, conference-wise.
Interesting.
I like the programs that the Big 12 added from a softball perspective. BYU's a perennial tournament team. UCF and Houston are really, really good softball programs. Cincinnati, fine with football. They don't matter here. But the thing that the Big 12 is losing is there's two things I think they're losing. One is they're losing a ton of stature in the softball world because BYU is a perennial tournament team. How many super regionals have it gone to? Is it one, two?
One.
Yeah,
One.
UCF, Houston. Houston had a couple of really good years. Both have had really good talent come through, but none of those three, you combine those three, you don't get to where Texas and Oklahoma are in terms of stature and softball relevance.
Fair.
Now, granted,
but I think what you're hoping there, if you're the Big 12, you're buying stock, kind of like the Americans doing with Charlotte, North Texas. You're buying stock with resources they're about to get and improvements with facilities and talent recruiting and everything like that they can get there because they've accomplished pretty good stuff considering the limited resources those programs have had.
You're buying stock. I think you're taking a riskier bet if you're the Big 12 than if you're the American. Because I think the Big 12's got more to lose because of how much stature. Because, like I say, Oklahoma and Texas are two blue bloods.
Yes,
like only a handful.
Oh yeah, you can't compare that. Yeah, I agree with that.
So I think the Big 12 loses because you're losing all that stature. And I think take Oklahoma and Texas out of the Big 12 and just look at the Big 12 softball scene. You don't view it the same way. You don't see Big 12 softball the same way. You got Oklahoma State at the top. You've got UCF and Houston, and some of the other ones are still there. You know, Texas Tech, Baylor, Iowa State, all that. And they're in that pack underneath Oklahoma State. But you just don't view the Big 12 the same way. They're still really good teams. They're still going to be a power conference. They're going to have, quality teams. They're going to have multiple teams in the tournament. But you just don't view the conference the same way, I don't think, with OU and Texas gone. So I think the Big 12 actually loses on this one.
They might, but I still think they're going to be a multi-bid league. I still think they're going to be very rated high in a league standpoint. Maybe they're not the second or third best conference in the sport in a given year, but maybe they're still fourth or fifth. Whereas Conference USA, man, that's got one bid league written all over that. That's a huge hit. Yeah. I would say the Southland too, because what's left there. I mean, that hurts McNeese. You could argue McNeese is kind of a loser in this department, although the counter argument to that is the Southland's usually been a one-bid league anyway, but now you're traveling more. It's interesting. It's going to be interesting how all this plays out moving forward. We still got time between now and whenever all these moves happen to discuss it. Of course, the ultimate goal for all these programs is to end up at Oklahoma City, and that's where you two were at this year covering the Women's College World Series, which – gentlemen, had a lot of storylines on and off the field. My question to you is, what's your biggest takeaway from the 2021 Women's College World Series being there in Oklahoma City in person, starting with you, Justin? Was it an on-the-field story or off-the-field? Or what was the thing that stands out to you in 2021's World Series edition?
I think it was a combination of on and off the field. Because it was James Madison, but it was James Madison and what James Madison being there meant to me. So James Madison getting there, obviously, really big deal. You don't see a lot of mid-majors make the World Series. You don't see 3 seeds from the regional round make the World Series. You don't see a team go through 2 different SEC teams and make the World Series oftentimes. Couple that with, JMU played a smaller, depleted schedule. They had a bunch of super seniors who wouldn't have been there outside of COVID. A lot of storylines. And then JMU comes in and does what they do. And it was great. It was great to see. It was great to witness in person. Even the JMU fans and the alumni sections and things like that were great. But for me, the extra part of that was this was the first time in several years where it actually truly felt like, because it happened, it felt like somebody outside the usual pack, air quotes there, could reach the World Series. Because if you think about it, over the last few years, you've had pretty much the same teams. You throw in a South Florida in 2012. You throw in a Louisiana Lafayette around that same time. You throw in a random one here and there. But in large part, it's been the same teams. It's Oklahoma every year. Since Garcia got there, it's UCLA every year. It's Washington every year. It's Florida. It's Alabama. It's LSU. It's the same teams. And there's nothing wrong with that because those teams are so great. But this JMU's run storyline in and of itself, but to me it also kind of re-energized the thought process that maybe it's not going to be the same group of 11 teams every year. Maybe, teams can still get through. And I think that's important for the game because once you start getting to be in the same teams in the World Series every year, there's stagnancy that comes along with that. So I think JMU to me was the biggest story, but then also what JMU meant, being there meant on a wider scale.
Victor?
I will say, guys, the biggest takeaway for me is just the confirmation that the Women's College World Series should be taken seriously as a national television event. The numbers were as high as it's ever been. Outrated consistently the Baseball World Series in Omaha. And it did so well that even with the weather forcing things into a Thursday game, I know I've already been nagged about why I had to leave. Thank you for the reminder. That they actually changed the schedule for this year's Women's College World Series to give that extra day of rest for teams to get to the championship game and taking out that semifinal, that elimination Saturday. The biggest thing I will say on the field has to be Montana fouls. All due respect to Oklahoma. We all kind of felt, and Florida State fans will say, hey, Florida State took game one and Oklahoma had to push to win that national championship, which was well earned. It felt to me, it felt like Montana Foul's coming out party. She had the perfect game on her birthday versus UCLA. And I remember being in the press box. It was in the second inning, and I was talking to one of the writers from the Associated Press. And she had that it was a fifth or sixth strike. We kind of looked at each other. We're like, we may be watching something special here. And sure enough, it happened. So even though Alabama did not win the national championship, I felt that we got an appreciation of the type of player Montana Fouts is. And now she has that motivation, that chip on her shoulder to try not only get back to Oklahoma City this year, but to win it all, to get that confirmation that she is the best softball pitcher in the world right now.
Currently is making the claim to be the face of the sport going into 2022 is something that obviously me and Jenna Becerra talked about at length there. Kind of some quick thoughts here from the Women's College World Series here, Justin. Let's go back to the off the field story. That picked up a lot of steam as far as that late night game, Florida State, Oklahoma State. What time did that game start? You two were there. It was like 12. I think it was like past midnight Eastern time zone. And there was a lot of livid people on social media. A lot of you guys were there. Take me through that. Obviously, it's impacted. Victor, you mentioned it. The schedule's been changed. I think that's a huge story. Part of it in 2021, and it was that late night game. It still drew a big audience, but it caused a lot of fire. You guys were in the middle of all that. What was that like as that was unfolding, Justin?
Well, I fell asleep in the press box a couple of times.
Oh.
I mean, I think there were some changes that needed to be made, and honestly, I think it was going to take it getting to that point where we're playing softball or covering softball, like Vic and I were, at 2:30 in the morning local, where you're sitting there, it's black as night, when the game's starting. And I think it's just one of those things where you kind of have to get to the extreme before something happens about it. It was one of the more unique experiences I've ever had in a press box. I'm not going to lie. I mean, unique's a euphemism there, but it's a good word for it. I mean, I was impressed too that, a lot of people had a problem with it. A lot of people had a well-founded problem with it. But the team still went out there. They still did what they had to do. The players played. The coaches coached. Some of us writers wrote. I was impressed with the resilience there because it could be very easy to go out at that time of night and, just sit out in right field and fall asleep like I did in the press box. I was impressed with the resilience, but I also think it was a necessary thing to happen to get to the point where that doesn't happen again, where that doesn't become a regular thing where, it rains in Oklahoma is a thought before you get to Oklahoma. That was my thought. I didn't care for it at the time, don't get me wrong, but I think it was a necessary happening to affect what eventually needed to happen, needed to change.
And it is. It will change now in 2022 with the new schedule. There'll be a day between the championship series and the semis there, the World Series. So we'll see how that goes, and we'll see how the schedule looks and how that will impact from a television standpoint, ratings and all that. To me, guys, the play of the year happened there in the World Series. And I think of Odyssey Alexander, who you talk about one of the top stories in 2021 was Odyssey Alexander and leading JMU. You mentioned it earlier, Justin, about JMU making that run. Well, Odyssey was a big part of that. And to me, the defining play of the World Series was the flip play that she did against Oklahoma State in the winner's bracket game. That's something that obviously she addressed in the post game. That's all people talked about. Big debate between her and the Jesse Warren play, which I was fortunate enough to see in person in 2018 in the National Championship Series, Game 1 against Washington. Victor, you were there. We talked about it at the time. But Odyssey Alexander, who you covered, by the way, you called some of her games because she would go on to play for USSSA in the summer. But take me through that moment in that Odyssey Alexander experience, which had a rippling effect beyond softball.
It was one of those plays, Eric, that you were there, you were amazed that you saw it, but everything else after that was kind of, it felt secondary because there was still a buzz in the press box about that play. And it's not only that the play happened. Let's remember, it was the timing of when the play happened that took it to that level, similar to Warren's play and the timing of when that happened. It was in the 7th inning where Washington had the tying run on when it was still a 1-run game, and then Warren hit the double play. Alexander gets that out. Oklahoma State doesn't score, and then JMU beats Oklahoma State and then sends them to the losers bracket again where they had to deal with the late start versus Florida State. So you think about how many different scenarios could have been changed if Alexander doesn't get that tag, or if she doesn't get that ball cleanly, or the runner hand hits the home plate before she gets that tag. How I hate to say this word, the narratives that could have been rewritten if one aspect of that play goes entirely different. And the stadium, I've never heard a stadium go that loud for a defensive play in terms of that significance before. And I might even include the Warren play. Eric, I'll defer to you since you saw that play in person in 2018.
Well, Justin might be the best person because he saw both plays in person live. Like, Justin, you saw the tag with Odyssey, the diving play by Warren in Game 1. I mean, you were there for both. Which one do you think is the more memorable play? It's hard. I mean, that's probably the top 2 defensive plays in the history of the Women's College World Series. I mean, the Odyssey play was incredible because it's like it's diving in there for the tag. They both were tremendous athletes. Where do you stand on that one, Justin?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that. I think the one thing about the Warren play was that she had to get up and throw to first and catch the runner off. I think that's one element of the Warren play that gets, because the dive was spectacular, but the presence of mind to get immediately to her feet and throw to first base and get the double play in that moment, in that scenario. I think, to me, that's the Warren ekes out by a hair because of that. Not taking anything away from Odyssey Alexander's. Alexander's play is going to make highlight reels for the next decade. Like, every time it's going to be in the World Series credits if I had to bet every year. And it should be. It was a spectacular play, and I think I watched the replay 16 times after I got back to my Airbnb that night. But to me, the Warren one sneaks out just by a hair because of the presence of mind to throw to first, to get that out, and situationally where it was. Just by a hair. And that's not taking anything away from Alexander. It's just boosting Warren up a hair.
An iconic play, a memorable run, historic run by JMU, and a historic team that ends up winning the national championship in Oklahoma. But it wasn't as easy as people thought. This is a historic offense, scored runs, but they came back from the losers bracket. Hadn't seen that in a while. Florida State did it in 2018, but you had 2 teams in Oklahoma and Florida State that both came from the losers bracket. And people ask Patty Gasso, of course, Oklahoma comes from behind to beat Florida State. They lost the first game, won the series in 3. They asked Patty Gasso afterwards, where does this team rank, comparing it to the 2013 team, which Victor knows this. He's tired of me hearing about mentioning this. I've said that the 2013 team is the greatest softball team. Oklahoma team is the greatest team I ever saw. Pitching, offense, defense, all together. A lot of people. Now, Patty Gasso didn't kind of answer the question in the pressers, but you guys can. Where do you rank this Oklahoma team? Do you think it's better than the 13 Oklahoma team? Do you think it's the best team of all time? Where do you rank this Oklahoma team now that they won the national title? The fact that they struggled, does that hurt their legacy? As weird as that sounds to some, because some might say, well, they didn't dominate, etc. Where do you guys stand, Justin? We're starting with you on the Oklahoma legacy of this Sooner 2021 team.
I don't think the fact that they struggled and lost a couple of games, it makes as big of a difference as it might seem. I think the way they played throughout the year, the way they got through the postseason, the teams they beat in the postseason, and then ultimately, I think there's something to be said for having your backs against the wall for the first time at that stage and still responding. Because it can be really easy to, if that's your first time pinned against the wall, to collapse. And they did.
Yep.
I don't think this is the best Oklahoma team. I like that 2013 team. I think the offense for Oklahoma this year might be the best one I've seen. The fact that they had true freshmen, that they had a couple of transfers, that they had, and they had Jocelyn Allo, which, let's be honest, watching Jocelyn Allo hit is a gift to the world.
Yes.
I think the offense this year in 2021 for Oklahoma might be the best I've seen. But from a team-wide perspective, I don't think it is. I think the pitching, even though Juarez was really good in the World Series, to me, the pitching still missed a beat, maybe 2 during the regular season. So I give the 2013 team, to your point, the nod for that reason. But this is a team that's not going to be forgotten really quickly. And a large part of that is the offense and the dominance throughout the year. Because if you look at the home runs and the runs scored and how many players contributed significantly to that, and the fact that this is a team this good and still manages to find a way to get all their big hitters in the lineup somehow, some way. And the number of times that, yes, they played some really bad competition at times. We talked about that in the postseason. But still, it's tough to put 29 runs on somebody on the worst team in the country. That's not just, you can't just do that with the snap of your finger. And they put double digits on a lot of teams this year. So I don't think it's the best Oklahoma team ever. I think 13 still wins that crown. But from an offensive perspective, I could have watched this Sooner offense every day of the week and twice on Sunday and been just fine with it.
Victor, I know when you flew up to that was the thing you wanted to see in person, that Oklahoma offense in person. Your thoughts? Where do you stack this here as far as your opinion, leaving OKC, seeing that team in person?
That might be the greatest offense ever in college softball for that one season. From 1 through 9, they can hit for power. They had high averages. They could run. They were intelligent on the base paths. And I think in that game, in that series, they may have found their next big star in Mackenzie Donahue, the left fielder, because she made 2 leaping catches in left field within a 3-game stretch. And then all of a sudden we see like Air Jordan S signs with the leap with Donahue, and everyone's going, Lou. And I'm literally sitting here like, I remember telling you just about this, like, I think they may have found a star in our hands. And you don't have that. And oh, by the way, you got the player of the year in Jocelyn Allo, who just crushed home runs with the best of them. And let's put this in perspective. The fact that Florida State had to come from the losers bracket again to play in the championship, beat Oklahoma in game 1, and fought them tooth and nail to the very end. We need to give more credit to Lonnie Alameda, because I feel, and please correct me if I'm misstep here, I don't think we are giving Coach Alameda the proper credit she deserves. She is easily, in my opinion, one of the 5 best coaches in college softball right now. led a team to a national championship in 2018, took them to a play for a number one this past year, has made the Women's College World Series 3 of the last 5 years, and has consistently found a way to get her team to be there at the end. And we don't mention her as much as the Gassos, as the Murphys, as well then when he was coaching Kendrea, as the Victorinas, but she still finds herself in Oklahoma City. But she doesn't get that recognition, even though she's won a national title.
Made a great run, ran into an onslaught team in Oklahoma that won the national title. I'm envious of both of you because you both could make the claim that you both covered maybe the greatest or most memorable Women's College World Series ever for some of these stories that we have discussed. And we haven't even brought up perhaps arguably the biggest story of them all, the retirements of legendary head coaches Lou Harris-Champer at Georgia and Mike Kendrea at Arizona. Gentlemen, I know, Victor, that's something you're real proud of is you got to cover Mike Kendrea's last 2 Women's College World Series appearances. I was fortunate enough to call an Arizona game and see Arizona in person live during the regular season when they played UCF. Justin, you've seen Arizona more often. But when you think of the memorable moments in the top stories of 2021, the Mike Kendrea, we'll start with him. Mike Kendrea's retirement, pretty significant. It was a story going into the whole postseason and going into Oklahoma City. What will you remember about that? Because there was a lot of Arizona fans there. And then, of course, he officially announced the retirement a couple days later after in front of all the alumni there. One of the biggest names in the history of this sport. He mentioned in the presser, like he wanted to do it like Frank Sinatra, Victor.
Yes. And I think, Eric, and Coach Kendrea said in that press conference how ESPN approached him and said he wanted to make an announcement. And Kendrea said, no. The only person who gets to tell Mike Kendrea when it's time for him to leave coaching is Mike Kendrea. All due respect to Holly Rowe. She's the best at what she does. But Mike Kendrea has done enough for the game where he gets to tell us when it's time for him to hang it up. But we all got that sense after that walk-off versus Florida State Saturday to eliminate Arizona. The shot to him in the dugout, him taking the lineup card down. All of the alumni that you mentioned, we saw in the stands. You saw Kenzie Fowler there, Leah O'Brien Amico, who did a radio commentary for Westwood One. She was in the stands as well. They kind of knew that this was going to be it for Coach Kendrea. And he actually mentioned in a previous interview that he wanted to go out with this senior class, Deja Mulipola, Jesse Harper and company, that he wanted, whenever they left Arizona, that was when he was going to ride up into sunset too. So it felt fitting that Kendrea got to go out on his home terms. Also, it was fitting that one of his legendary players got to take over for him and Caitlin Lowe.
Yeah, and I'll never forget the regional, Wheaton Ole Miss, the emotions there, Justin. Where does this rate? Where is this? To me, the Mike Kendrea retirement is my number one top story of 2021 because, we just had the recent news this week, obviously, of John Madden, the legendary NFL head coach, former Hall of Fame head coach, broadcaster, video game extraordinaire. This was a significant news in football because John Madden affected a lot of people. He's a huge impact in football, from a head coach of the Raiders in the 70s, Super Bowl champion, the greatest sportscaster ever in football, reinvented how a football broadcast comes. By the way, he analyzed the game was the best in his industry for 2 decades. There was nobody close to him. And then obviously the Madden game, which Victor knows very well, and I do. Everybody, a casual video game player has played Madden. It's probably the most popular video game of all time. And to me, Mike Kendrea in some ways is the John Madden of softball. You don't have to be a softball fan, but you know who Mike Kendrea is. Think of the players, arguably one of the most recognizable people in the history of softball. Jenny Finch played for Mike Kendrea. One of the most famous U.S. national teams, Olympic teams ever. The softball team in 2004, the Dream Team, coached by Mike Kendrea. No one's won more national titles than Mike Kendrea. He's the go-to guy when you need an opinion on the sport. Mike Kendrea. It's synonymous with softball. Who knows? I would not be shocked if we see him doing some media work in 2022 because he's that smart and talented. But to me, that's the top story is Mike Kendrea retirement. Thoughts, Justin?
It's one of the things that when people think about 2021 in a decade, one of the first things their brain's going to go to is Mike Kendrea retiring. And I think the one thing that I'll never forget about the way Kendrea did it, like Vic said, he went out on his terms. But the one thing I'll never forget in that sense about how it happened and all that is Kendrea did it in classic Kendrea style. From before the regional, there was talk, well, Kendrea's last year, he's going to retire. In the regional, this is Kendrea's last year, Kendrea's going to retire. You see the special moments on the field, the last time at Hillenbrand, the lineup card. Oh, this is Kendrea's last this, last that. Super regionals, Kendrea's last super regional. Oh, it's Kendrea's last World Series. All this talk, all this chatter, everybody seemed to know it. The one person who wouldn't say was Mike Kendrea because he had a senior class, he had a World Series team, and Kendrea, it was never about Kendrea for how many years? Almost 40, 36 was it? It was never about Kendrea. And Kendrea's retirement, nothing was the World Series was not going to be about Kendrea. He was going to do it his way. Now, World Series ends, Kendrea says, I'm retiring in his way. And then, the Lowe and Moat and all that get to go on the road recruiting. That's the one thing that I remember stuck out to me so much was the fact that not only did Kendrea retire and the impact that's had, but the way he did it just solidified the legacy he's got in softball because he didn't make a big show. Kendrea could have easily announced in March, hey, this is my last year. And the entire rest of the season would have been a great, deserved retirement tour. Every Pac-12 team would have had a gift and an honorarium. The regional would have had an honorarium, TV broadcast, the super regional, the World Series. You could have had everything. You could have had a Mariano Rivera, Derek Jeter style retirement tour, but he didn't. And that to me was the one thing that I'll remember about it. And especially being there, hearing the chatter, and still Kendrea says nothing. He says nothing until after it's all said and done. That to me just embodied Mike Kendrea over 36 years to a T. And that's the one thing I'll remember more than anything else.
Historic, legendary, and yet perhaps arguably not the most surprising retirement out of the World Series, gentlemen, because Lou Harris-Champer, after Georgia gets eliminated on Saturday, they announce on Sunday via press release she's retiring. You both were. What were your reaction? You both, I would assume, were in the press box when this all went down. What did you guys remember about that? Tony Baldwin ends up taking over, so they keep it internal. But that one came out of left field, whereas the Kendrea stuff that was kind of building and building, you could sense something was up. Nobody saw the Champer thing coming at all, right?
Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't we walking into the press box that Sunday when we heard the news initially of Lou retiring, and we were both like, what?
We were on the ramp right from the concourse to the press box.
Yeah, and we're like, huh? I look down to see the news. I see Georgia's Twitter handle. Like, wow. We expected someone to announce their retirement on Sunday. If you had Lou Harris-Champer, one, you a lie, and two, tell us the winning lottery numbers for this upcoming Saturday's drawing, please and thank you. But and here's the thing. Coach Lou told her, I believe the reports were she told her team when they arrived in Athens from Oklahoma City that Sunday that she was retiring. So as much as we kind of saw Mike Kendrea coming, nobody saw this coming. No Georgia source. And give credit. I want to give credit, just like Justin gave credit to Coach Kendrea for not making this about him. Give credit to Coach Lou Harris-Champer and the people of Georgia, because she did not want anybody to know that this was going to be her last year until the season was over with. Because like Kendrea, she didn't want her players to be subjected to all those questions about, how you feel about playing for Coach Lou in her last year in the World Series, all that stuff. But as much as Coach Kendrea has made to the game, Coach Lou Harris-Champer, she's done wonders for what she did at Georgia, and prior to that, Southern Miss leading another back-to-back World Series with Courtney Blaze. And I find it fitting, now that we think about it, the last few innings of Coach Lou's career at Georgia, she had the daughter of the pitcher that first got her to the World Series pitching in the circle for Georgia.
That's full circle right there. That's good stuff. That's good. Great point. It's a great point. Tony Baldwin will take over. His first game is scheduled to be in Orlando in February in 2021 when they play at UCF.
Are we going to be going live when that game's done too, or no?
To be determined in 2022.
Okay.
That's why you make sure you follow us. Of course, that's not the only major move in the coaching carousel in the SEC, Justin, in 2021. Kind of a light carousel, a lot of moves, but not the blockbusters of a Kendrea retirement and Lou Harris. But Ralph Weekley, the associate coach at Tennessee, retiring. That caused a big effect because Chris Malvo goes from Missouri to Tennessee to take over, arguably the biggest move from an assistant coach standpoint in 21. Your thoughts on Ralph and the year that was in coaching carousel in 21?
Well, Ralph Weekley's been around for a minute, and it's hard to imagine Tennessee without that pair because, even when Ralph wasn't coaching third base and Karen coaching third base, you still know Ralph's in the dugout. You still see Ralph in interviews. I've always loved talking to Ralph Weekley in an interview because the man says exactly what he thinks. So even when, like I say, like when Ralph wasn't coaching third and now it's Karen coaching third, you still saw Ralph. You still knew Ralph was there. It's still Ralph and Karen Weekley co-head coaches. So to me, I think it's a different image for Tennessee for sure. Karen's still there, so it's not a changing of the guard. And Ralph's even still around, but he's just not co-head coach anymore. So I do think it's a little bit of a different identity for Tennessee. And then you bring in Chris Malvo as the assistant coach to fill the third coach's spot, and that's a big deal for Tennessee and a big deal for Missouri where he left because the man's a really good hitting coach. Chris Malvo is a really solid hitting coach. And, yes, Ralph retiring opened that door for Malvo to come in, but I think Malvo coming into Tennessee, period, is a really big deal for the Lady Vols. I think it's a game changer. I don't want to take away from Ralph retiring because I think that by itself changes. I mean, like you say, Kendrea, Champer, and Weekley. That's three of the coaches that you identify with softball.
Yeah,
World Series.
Easily the biggest three coaching news transaction in the carousel of 2021. They'll be remembered for sure.
Yeah,
by far.
and it's not close, honestly.
No, not even
and
close.
Each of them has their own legacy. But after you get past the legacy that Ralph left behind when he retires, Malvo coming in makes a huge dent in Tennessee and leaves a little bit of a dent in Missouri because, that's a good hitting coach. Anytime you lose or gain a good hitting coach, it's a difference maker.
I think those are your top three. Arguably, another one that's top five coaching carousel moves took place in Division II, Victor. Michelle Frew, September, the longtime Rollins head coach, well. It was announced. She announced retirement in September. Christine Rozier would get hired about a month or so later to take over. Former alum, obviously arguably the greatest Rollins Tar player of all time. Hey, all right, no big deal. That's, okay, cool. Except that retirement didn't last long for Michelle Frew, did it, Victor?
No, she got hired in November to take over the program at the University of Charleston in West Virginia. A Charleston team that won 34 games in 2021. So, we'll spare the time in terms of all the situation. I find it interesting that Coach Frew said that she retired, and then she gets hired by Charleston and went out of her way to credit the athletic department and administration of Charleston. I would just leave it at that. That was the biggest offseason news in Division II. The big one on the field, Victor, West Texas A&M coming from behind, just like in Division I, to come from behind to beat Biola to win the national title in Division II, wasn't it? Yeah, big play. That shall mark the first time, gentlemen, in the since all three divisions had championship series, and all three championship series went to 3 games. So it's not really surprising that you have West Texas A&M come out and win. A credit to Biola, who in that first year making the tournament, make it all the way to the national championship. And Coach Nikki Reagan, formerly Nikki Udria from Oregon, went back to her alma mater to join Missy Lombardi's staff. So congratulations to her. And now West Texas A&M will try and do something that no team has done in over 2 decades, and that's try to repeat as national champions. But we're going to get into Division II a lot in 2022, sir.
But interestingly, the hype, maybe the national championships got more hype than even Division II, was Division III, with 2 of the biggest heavyweights in Virginia Wesleyan and the defending national champion in Texas Lutheran. 2 of the best coaches in Division III, maybe of all college softball, Brandon Elliott and, of course, Wade Wilson. This was a much hype matchup. Virginia Wesleyan wins it behind Hannah Hall, who goes down as the greatest player in Division III history and goes down, in my opinion, as my pick for Player of the Year in 2021. I know some people are like, wait a minute, that's Division III. I don't care. She's the greatest player in Division III history. She won 3 national championships, has every significant record in Division III, put Virginia Wesleyan on the map with Brandon Elliott. To me, Hannah Hall is the Player of the Year in 2021. That's a story, too. Her legendary career, going out on top, getting that extra year, going out on top to win that national title for Brandon Elliott, Justin.
Yeah. One day we're going to do a podcast and debate the best Division III player either, because there's Allison Fournier from Tufts.
Whoa!
I mean, it's tight.
Whoa,
but,
Justin, fight back there, Victor.
No, Hull was really good, and because she was at D3, she never got her due, and that's not right because she was really, really good. Are you asking me who my Player of the Year is?
Yes, that's called that's a good segue there.
Just making sure here, because I had that D3 player of all time thing, and there's probably somebody from the 90s. But
I didn't mean to start up a big controversial topic here. I did not.
Whoa!
For me, my athlete of the year was Valerie Cagle from Clemson. 2 reasons. 1, college, because she put Clemson on her back. She wasn't the only one that contributed by any means, not pitching and not hitting. But she put Clemson on her back. Without her, Clemson's not where they are this year. It's a new program, but Cagle's also a new player to the college world. She's not a seasoned super senior here. And to do what she did in the circle and at the plate all year long, and then this summer to do what she did with the USA junior team, just to addendum to what she did, or this fall, winter, I guess, not this summer.
Helped to win the gold, right? With the game-winning hit.
Yes.
She had, to me, I have her as athlete of the year because she played 2 sides of the ball consistently, played the outfield even when she wasn't pitching. She didn't just DP. She played the outfield, threw some runners out. And then the kid is an incredible athlete. She's still young. She put Clemson on her back, got them to an ACC title in their first full season, and then goes out and, just helps carry the U.S. junior national team to a championship, not a national championship, just to a championship. To me, I had Cagle as athlete of the year, not taking away from Hannah Hull or some of the others that I considered who were great athletes and who had great years, but to me it was Cagle. I just felt like she embodied athlete of the year, honestly.
Victor, you want to chime in on the D3 greatest player of all time debate here? No, I'm just kidding. Who's the greatest athlete of the year in 21? We'll settle D3 down the road, I guess.
Wow. I tried to mention Shannon McGroom from West Texas A&M, helping them win the national championship. I also agree. I think Johnson Allo should get consideration, but I'm with Justin here. You look at what Valerie Cagle did, both as a pitcher and a hitter. She won both pitcher and player of the year in the ACC. One player winning both major awards in a conference. That tells you the level of dominance she had on both sides. And gentlemen, if you remember back in February, I said Clemson was going to make it to the Super Regional. On Justin McLeod, I remember the look on your face when I made that statement. And if not for the fact that they got sent to Tuscaloosa, where Alabama never loses a regional, they would have gone to supers and maybe more. So, yeah, was I wrong? Yeah, but can you fault me for that with the way that she was playing?
Unbelievable! Wow, this turned into like a
just bringing. You said you were wrong, so I didn't have to point it out. That's all I was going to.
All right, it's very good choices. I'm going to throw a couple quick names.
Yep.
Danielle Laurie, what a comeback! Her, Kat Osterman, Team USA, and of course Athletes Unlimited. Danielle Laurie leading Canada, their first ever bronze medal coming out of retirement. Jen Salling was fantastic. Another name to throw out there. Victoria Haywood. Haley McClenny, who I think showed why she was the best maybe all-around player in the world with her performance at Team USA. Yukiko Bueno coming out of retirement at Team Japan, leading them to the gold medal. Part of the Olympic stories there. Very competitive Olympics throughout that hopefully will help to move the sport moving forward. Alicia Ocasio, winning Athletes Unlimited, year 2. I think also should get consideration and named as well for Athlete of the Year. I'm glad you mentioned Alo because that otherwise Oklahoma fans will be all over both of you for the record. So
we don't need those problems.
Those are some of the Athletes of the Year. Thoughts on the Olympics here. Quick thought on the Olympics. To me, when I think of the Olympics, some of the more memorable games took place in the Olympics. Think back to USA, Australia, and all the scrutiny by the so-called experts. Oh, they can't hit. What's wrong with them? Where is Sissy? Where is so-and-so? Meanwhile, nobody else is hitting in the goddamn tournament, but apparently it's a U.S. problem. They're not everybody else's problem.
Wait. Gary, you get on me for almost cursing. You almost let one slip right there,
I really did. It still bothers me that there are people like, well, we should have just sent our best team.
You saw it started like, yeah.
Yeah, I held. But the U.S. Australia, the U.S.-Japan game, not the gold medal game, but the other one with the walk-on.
That's not my final game, yes.
That was a great game. U.S.-Canada, the bronze medal game, Canada beating Mexico. Those are some memorable games. I remember Danielle and Kat coming back, from retirement, among all the great stories in the Olympics. That's something to be worth mentioning. What jumped out to you, Justin, from there?
Well, I was one who said the U.S. team couldn't hit. So just for the record, just making that clear for the record. I think to me, I was impressed with the parity that international softball's gotten to. Because you have 6 teams that were there. And, I mean, like you say, they were close games. I mean, was it this? Was it that? I don't know. But they were tight games. They were good games. And, honestly, the team that really didn't do a whole lot in the Olympics itself has arguably the world's best hitter in Erica Piancastelli in Italy.
Yeah.
And that's, maybe 6 out of 6 that made it. So I was really impressed on that stage, that humongous stage. I was impressed with the parity that international softball's gotten to. Don't forget, there were some teams that just missed the Olympics. Think of Great Britain.
Yeah.
And
the depth of quality arms really stood out. And we're going to see some of them that participate in the Olympics, by the way, in the 2022 college softball season coming up here. Oregon State has one, so it goes on and on. But the quality of depth of arms, Canada, everybody had arms, and that's why you didn't see as much offense. It wasn't because we didn't send our best players. Maybe it's because the pitching was just better. How about that? Anyway, I'm going to move on here because I'm getting agitated now.
Move on, please. Eric, Festivus was last week, sir. You stop airing your grievances.
I know. Why didn't I should have just ranted there for
Thank you.
But Heather Tarr, by the way, is now the U.S. head coach. That's a storyline. Kendra Erickson retiring as the U.S. head coach. Of course, what an interesting 2021 for Heather. While she's in the Olympics, she's got to find her staff because JT D'Amico, another big move in the assistant move, going to Georgia to join Tony Baldwin's staff. So then she has to fill out her staff. So that was kind of wild in 2021 coaching carousel. But anyway, I mentioned those games. Any of the Olympics games to you guys was the top game of the year? What's your top game, Victor? Game of the year is what?
Game of the year. I'm leaning towards, I would say I think James Madison, Oklahoma State. That game in itself was tremendous outside of the Odyssey Alexander play. I think Canada, USA, Japan, the gold medal game, plenty of drama there. West Texas A&M Biola Game 3, the D2 National Championship Series. That had a lot of drama. Of course, West Texas A&M going on to win that game. A game that I think won't get mentioned a lot, but I think it should. Georgia Duke, the regional final. That was a wild back and forth game. Of course, a lot of controversy with Duke being the national seed, but Georgia getting the host because of the whole predetermined site situation. Duke is coming, ladies and gentlemen. Duke is coming. Duke is here with Marissa Young and company and Payne St. George coming back for a super senior season. So keep that in mind. That game was I was having that game on the TV on my laptop as well as some of the other games going on there. But if I had to say game of the year, I would have to go with I'll have to go with USA Japan gold medal game in Tokyo.
Wow.
That's my game of the year.
Holy man. I think you can make a case. No, I mean, look, anytime USA and Japan play, they're always great games. Those two games are really solid games. We prefer the U.S. win, but, it didn't happen. So, but those two games were tremendous games. Justin?
Okay, I'm going to cheat because I'm going to give you one in the regular season. I'm going to give you one in the postseason.
Fair.
Because I think the scales are different a little bit. Postseason for me was JMU Oklahoma. Because Oklahoma came into the world to start the World Series, like the literal 11 a.m. World Series opener. JMU came in as the underdog. Everybody thought 2 barbecue. Oklahoma came in going to run the table, and how the turntables turn. And it's an extra inning game. You get Kate Gordon's home run there in the 8th. That was a game that nobody expected to go the way it did. And then JMU dominates, and then Oklahoma. Just the way the game went was completely defied expectations. That was the game in the postseason for me. The one during the regular season actually fit a similar bill was Oklahoma and Georgia. Game 1 of the doubleheader they played. Oklahoma's first and one of only 2 regular season losses. Because remember, it was the same scenario. Oklahoma, they're in Athens, but sure, it is what it is. It ends up going to extra innings, and Georgia walks OU off. Now, granted, Oklahoma came back second game of the doubleheader, beating like 13-2 or something like that. But that game for me was a big one because it showed Oklahoma was vulnerable. I don't think many people realized at the time, but it showed us that Georgia actually was worth something, which they proved by getting to the World Series. And 3, it was just a really good game. It was a very even match game between 2 teams that didn't really look even matched. So that was the game of the regular season for me, was OU Georgia game 1 for variety of reasons. And yes, the common denominator here is Oklahoma, who apparently made for some good softball games this year. Who'd have thunk it?
Imagine that. I agree with most of what you guys have said there. JMU Oklahoma the tournament. I mean, everybody remembers that game. That stands out. I'll throw a couple bones. Florida State, LSU game 2, super regional, going 9 innings. I mean, those teams always play dramatic games because they always get paired together. Too much probably, but they produced a dramatic game. And I'm going to be a little biased here. Regular season game, best one I saw. I was fortunate to call Florida at UCF. Victor, remember we did a show. We had to do a show right after that.
Yes.
You had to calm me down because that was a dramatic game. There was a crowd. It was a back and forth game. Had a little bit of everything. Shout out to our friend Francesca Anel, who's a phenomenal analyst, was on top of her game in that game. And Carissa Ornelas with the walk-off homer on ESPN Plus. And that was the cool thing, being on ESPN Plus, it's like a national game, hits the walk-off to beat Florida, and everything went crazy. That's one of the best games I've ever seen in person, one of the best games I've ever broadcasted. Francesca deserves a ton of credit for that part of it. But to me, that is a regular season game that I will remember from that one. But postseason-wise, JMU, Oklahoma, I think you both you mentioned those. I think that's fair. LSU, Florida State, and then the Olympic Games, like you mentioned, Victor. So I'm on the same page with you guys on that. You mentioned JMU. Lauren Laporte, that's my coach of the year. Why? Because she became a big name now. She's no longer, hey, she was the assistant. She was the one that took over for Mickey Dean. Hey, she was the Mickey Dean assistant. Lauren Laporte now is a name. We've had her on the show. She talked about all the engagements, speaking engagements. She set the standard now for all the quote-unquote mid-majors and JMU softball. She's my coach of the year because that's what I'm going to remember from 2021, edging out Patty Gasso, obviously winning another national title at Oklahoma. Who's your coach of the year? Justin, you'll go first this time.
Oh, okay. Big pressure. Okay. Gasso is obvious, but I'm not going to go Gasso. I'm not going to go Laporte. I'm going to go a little off the wall here, but you got to give me a second to say why. Courtney Deifel, Arkansas. Here's why. Oklahoma and Patty Gasso had a tremendous year, but they're supposed to be where they are.
Mm-hmm.
Lonnie Alameda and Florida State had a tremendous run, but seeing them in the World Series is expected at this point. I could go John Rittman Clemson. I could go Laporte at JMU. But the one thing that kept coming back to me when I was preparing for this, and you told me that was going to be one of the ones that was said with the coach of the year, Arkansas is not supposed to be an SEC championship team. Arkansas historically is not supposed to be a super regional team. Yes, you can say the schedule was this, the roster was that, but Arkansas got there. They won the SEC title, shared it, sure, but they got there. Got to the title, close to the regional. To me, taking a team where they're quote unquote not supposed to be, air quotes again, is to me a defining moment in that kind of a thing. So I went Deifel, ultimate 2021 coach of the year, again edging out Gasso and Alameda for me.
Whew. Well, all of them are great choices, obviously. I am going to slightly go with Lonnie Alameda. Again, going back to what you talked about, Justin, Oklahoma was expected to be there at the start of the season. Arkansas, I can understand, but they had the talent from what we saw the previous 2 years that they could make that ascent to being in the super regional and playing for the SEC championship. The continued, I think, lack of respect that Florida State gets, people have Florida State actually losing at home in their regional to UCF. People actually pick Florida State to lose in their regional to UCF. I'm not going to name any names or anything, but I'm just saying. Then they go to Baton Rouge, and people thought they're going to be 2-0. Well, it was 2-0. 2-0 in favor of the people from Tallahassee. Then they get to the World Series. They got to play Alabama like, oh, they got to deal with Montana Fouls. They ain't got no shot at Montana Fouls. They eliminate Alabama. They beat Oklahoma game 1 and battle them nip and tug in games 2 and 3 to win the national championship. With Cass Sandercock, who a lot of people thought was going to be the number 2 going into the season behind Caitlin Arnold, who transferred in from Tennessee. But at the end, it was Sandercock who became the ace of the staff and got Florida State back to Oklahoma City and got them within the game of winning the national championship. And for her, remember, she did that with her longtime assistant, Travis Snyder, who's now at Texas A&M. So for her to do that with this new roster, without one of her longtime assistants, I think Lonnie Alameda deserves Coach of the Year. Also, can I give honorable mention to Pete Demore and what he did with Virginia Tech? That run they made, knocking off Arizona State and getting within one game in the Women's College World Series, beating UCLA and Westwood. The job that he did, him and Keely Rochard, Pete Demore deserves some credit as well.
That's pretty good. Other people, we didn't that normally would be in this mix. Patrick Murphy, Alabama head coach. He doesn't get our vote for Coach of the Year. However, Victor, he does win another accolade. Shall we do it, ladies and gentlemen? Shall we do it, Eric? Right. Folks, on our first episode of 2022, our first guest of the year 2022, we're rolling in with Patrick Murphy with our guests. We'll talk about Alabama, the outlook of 2022. They're going to be one of the national title favorites in 22. Montana Fouts, is she the face of the sport? I talked to Patrick Murphy about that. Plus, he got to be part of the Field of Dreams. He was in attendance for that big story in Major League Baseball this summer. They had the Field of Dreams game up in Iowa. I talk all of that with Patrick Murphy. That's in our first episode of 2022. We're rolling with a bang in 2022. Patrick Murphy, Alabama head coach, on In the Circle come our first episode of 22. Not bad to start. Not a bad way to start the year, right?
Not a
bad way to start the year on that. Quick couple other thoughts, too. Obviously, a story that could develop into 2022 was a story in 2021. COVID, obviously, not from a roster standpoint, from an extra year of standpoint, obviously impacts the transfer portal as well, but also affects the schedules. The Big Ten, for example, didn't play a non-conference schedule in 21. Other conferences played limited scheduling. As of now, that's a normal schedule, but obviously what we're going through, we don't know what the next month or two will tell us, but that will be a storyline going into 2022. But that was certainly a big story in 2021. We've discussed all the major stories of 2021 here on the show. What is your pick, gentlemen? The story of the year from 2021 is what?
Wow. The story of the year for me in 2021 will have to be just the explosion of the sport in terms of its popularity and proof that any team can get to Oklahoma City. The run that James Madison did, get into Oklahoma City, challenging the big boys, is proof that if you can still win at a quote unquote non-Power 5 school if you get the right coach, you get the right talent, and you have an administration that is willing to back you both with words and facilities. James Madison proved that. I think that was one of the big reasons why the move to the Sun Belt took place, not just because of football. But 2021 was the year of James Madison, and specifically Odyssey Alexander. And I think that gives confidence to all those other programs. Hey, we could be like James Madison. That could be us next year in Oklahoma City. We could do what Odyssey Alexander did. So that's my biggest storyline and moment of 2021.
Justin?
For me, it's conference realignment. I refuse to give COVID credit for being the biggest story of the year. But like I said earlier, I think the realignment, softball is number 2 to football in the sport that's most affected by it. And I don't think that can be underscored enough because I'm saying over basketball, over baseball, any of those. I think softball is right under football. And the realignment was so unexpected and so drastic and affected so many leagues and so much of the power shifts in college sports and in college softball and all that. To me, I think realignment, granted, the teams won't change until 22 or 23 or 25 or whatever, but I think all of that happening this summer, I think that's – and the way it's going to change the college sport outlook, the college softball makeup. And then also, let's be honest, you're talking about – money going places that during COVID we didn't know was going to exist, much less could go to. So I think that's an extra part of it. But for me, realignment's going to be the thing I think that defines 2021 by the time, a decade down the road.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on realignment. Victor, make a great point about the exposure of the game. We haven't mentioned Oklahoma-Washington, Game 2 Super Regional televised on ABC. First time ever softball on ABC. We expect to see more of that moving forward down the road in the future. Mine was realignment and the Mike Kendrea retirement are the big stories. Falling third a little bit. Justin McLeod's move to extra innings. I can't believe it. How is that? Blockbuster story. Justin, tell the audience one more time of your move to extra innings and where they can find your work there and what they can expect coming 2022.
Well, I didn't expect to talk about myself twice in the same episode, fellas, but okay. So I'm National College Softball Editor for Extra Innings Softball now. Still doing the exact same thing I've always done for 10 years at Justin's World Softball. I'm just doing it a different platform now. The website is extrainningssoftball.com. Twitter at extrainningsb. I'm still at Just Facts, man, because that's all you get from me, just the facts. And then starting January 3rd, we'll do conference forecasts like I've always done. Every Division I conference, all 32 conferences. Get into D2, some D3, all kinds of preseason stuff. January is going to be really busy, so it's a good time to find out that I'm an extra inning now. We've told you twice in this episode, so no reason not to find out. But extrainningssoftball.com. I'm on Twitter at JustFactsMa'am. Same stuff I've always done, just a different name and a much sexier title.
It's the biggest story, one of the top stories of 2021. Thank you, Justin, for coming on with us and obviously helping us not only this show, but throughout the year. And we'll definitely be doing more of you. We'll have you on again in 2022 on that. Of course, Victor, we've got a podcast
Yes.
coming out Thursday. Jenna Becerra, another media story, finished her second season at host and Believe Softball. You brought her in on our part of our Women's College World Series. She will be part of our Thursday episode, our final episode of 2021. She'll be a part of it. We'll talk about some of the top stories in college softball that we maybe didn't touch on this particular program, but she will be on that program. We'll touch on that. That's going to be a part of multi. And then, as we mentioned earlier, Patrick Murphy will be our guest on Monday, January 3rd. Big show there, Alabama. I hear they're playing a football game that's kind of important over there. I've heard. I personally think there's.
I consider that the precursor to our episode with Coach Murphy on Monday.
There you
but
go.
That's
a good way. That's a very good way to put it. So Patrick Murphy will be on Monday. Our most recent episode, by the way, it's been a hot one. Jerry Glasgow opening up at Louisiana, his pitching coach hire, his thoughts on the Sun Belt. Make sure you check that out. If you look at our archives, we have Heather Tarr talking about being the U.S. head coach and her new staff at Washington. Caitlin Lowe taking over from Mike Kendrea. All of that is on our In the Circle, wherever you listen to the podcast devices, as well as on our YouTube page right here, where you're watching this right now. Subscribe. Give us a thumbs up. Give us a nice review. Right here on YouTube there. This has been a blast. Always enjoy another live show. That's been a big part of 2021. We did a live show season preview. We did shows from the Women's College World Series nightly. Other shows imitate, but there's only one original, and that's right here over here. We did an Olympic show. We've done a ton of all. We'll have more new surprises in 2022. But until then, for Justin McLeod, for Victor Anderson, we hope you've enjoyed this edition, our special of In the Circle Live here on our YouTube page. Make sure you subscribe. We'll have all the content. We'll have Sunday night conversations. We'll leak out some interviews before it comes out on the podcast on Monday. So that's the benefit of being a subscriber on our YouTube page. We'll have some more live shows coming in 2022, certainly to preview the 2022 college softball season. So for Victor Anderson and Justin McLeod, I'm Eric Lopez. Happy New Year. Enjoy it. Be safe. And we'll talk to you around the corner on In the Circle here on
Good night, Canada.
YouTube. There you go. Good night, everybody.